This is the second iceberg. If you've watched the first one, this is me trying to do it right this time and still failing. And I've actually cut out the bit that didn't go right. It went horribly wrong. I wanted to have some very warm clouds at the bottom of the picture, and there were warm clouds in the photograph. And I used raw sienna and permanent rose and put those in, and then everything else went wrong. So I let that dry, re-wet the sky again, and now I have just phthalo blue, and I'm going to do a graded wash coming down the paper. That means I've started with quite strong phthalo blue at the top of the sky, and as I come down the sky towards the warm clouds at the bottom, I'm going to add more and more water to my mix. I have my board tilted. You need to tilt the board so that the bead of paint is always flowing down the page, not backwards up the page. And that's really important. The bead of paint is that wet layer of paint that allows you to go in and paint with no brush strokes. And you have to do it fast, and you have to do it carefully. And don't keep going back and painting over where you've painted. You can't do that. You pick up the bead of paint and you go along it in one sort of stroke and fill it in, and make sure you still have a bead of paint at the bottom to keep it wet. And I'm adding more and more water now. In fact, it's just water on my brush, which is a little bit stained with the blue, down to my horizon. And I have to keep the board tilted while it's drying, otherwise the water will run back into the sky and make blooms and blossoms and marks that you don't want. And what I was doing there, I dripped a little bit of the paint on the iceberg. I was just trying to wipe it back a little bit. I have put on the ocean, I already put a little bit of Viridian green on there, and now I have phthalo green mixed with some cobalt blue and a little bit of ultramarine blue, and I'm putting the very dark ocean on. Again, I made a mistake. I forgot to leave white for reflection. So it's a beautiful white reflection coming off of this iceberg. And when I was putting on my first wash of Viridian, I forgot to wet that and leave it white. I'm going to fix that later with some Dr. P.H. Martin's bleed-proof white and paint the reflections and the little bits that need to be a crisper white at the end. And these two iceberg videos are sort of what to do when you do it wrong, which often happens to painters. Watercolorists especially have things go wrong a lot, and it's not like acrylic and oil where you just fix your mistake with the next layer. It's there forever. You have to find some very creative ways to fix your mistakes. I've put in ultramarine blue with the green and a little Prussian blue for the background. And now I'm mixing up two mixes to work on the shadow side of the iceberg. I have Prussian blue with ultramarine blue and a little bit of phthalo blue. And I also have a Viridian mix that's Viridian with cobalt blue, and I'm going to switch from one to the other as I paint, letting them blend wet in wet, so that I have a little bit of green tinge to the ice and then a bluish tinge. And that is what the photo looked like. Many different, very cool, very dark blues on the shadow side of the iceberg. And you'll notice that that phthalo blue sky that I put on with my wash was quite dark when it was wet and has dried very light. And I want the iceberg to really stand out against it. And all of those things are a judgment in values when you're deciding what value do I want the color of my paint. And with watercolor, you adjust the value by adding water or using less water or layering. You can start light and go over with 3-4 layers of paint, getting darker each time if you decide you haven't gone dark enough. And also when you're doing this wash, it's like doing the sky wash. It's better to maybe tilt your paper up a little bit, or at least work with a bead of wet paint so you don't get a back run or any strange things happening with your paint. Don't keep painting over where you've already painted. It's not house painting. It's not even oil painting. You don't need to blend with your brush or keep painting an area where you've painted. Once you have painted with your watercolor, you just leave it alone. I know that's very hard for some people to do. They want to just go back in and keep stroking the paint with their brush. Great for oil painting, it blends it beautifully. Horrible for watercolor, you just get lots of brush strokes and your brush removes all the paint as you do that. Of course, if you want to remove paint, that's a great way to do it. Now, this little area at the end of the iceberg is very tricky. You need I've got I think my number 4 brush, and I'm going to come back with some white paint later to really sharpen that up. I have my reference photo beside me, and I'm looking at that very carefully to try and decide where those shadows are on the edge of the iceberg. And the closer you look at your reference material, the more different shadows you will see, the more little cracks and highlights. It's amazing how many there are when you really give it close study. And you can see I'm switching from a more green paint to a more blue paint to my more dilute paint as I go, so I get some variation. I'm going and doing what I told you not to do, but there are shadows on this iceberg, on this edge. And where I had a little bit of a paint bloom, I decided to try and fix that by putting one of the shadows in so that you can see the brush stroke. And I'm going around, there's a shadow along the ice on the side, and that's pretty close to a cobalt and ultramarine mix. The very shadowed side is the coolest side, so I've used my very cool green mixes on that side. And the side facing the light more, I'm going to use my warmer blues, which is the cobalt blue with a little bit of permanent rose added, and ultramarine blue, although not so much ultramarine on this side because it's quite strong and I want to keep this side fairly light, although there is a dark patch where I'm painting now that was in deep shadow, so that's got a couple of layers on and darker paint. If you go nice and dark, it will make your lights, your whites, seem much brighter. So don't be afraid to put the darks on there. I'm mixing cobalt with some permanent rose now for some of the warmer shadows. That makes a sort of a violety blue. A lot of water with them, so very gentle. And these were very interesting shadows that came down the front of the iceberg, and a little bit more rose with it now to warm it up even more. And water to blend it in. Now I'm going into the Viridian mix to put a cooler shadow. And of course pink and green are complementary colors, so having them close to each other, even though there's very little pink in there and not a lot of green, it still works for complementary colors, however little you use of them. And I'm charging, it's called charging, when you put more pigment into a wet area where the shadow is deeper next to the crack in the ice. Now I'm going to show you how I'm going to fix my mistake. I've got my Dr. Martens Bleed Proof White and I've diluted it with water, and I've got my small number 2 brush, and I'm putting in those white reflections from the iceberg. They will really lighten up the ocean, make it look like water when you get some horizontal reflections in there. And I also sharpened up some of the edges on the iceberg that I wanted to look nice and clean and crisp and white. When I first started watercolor painting many years ago, I was told all these rules that you're not supposed to use white, you're supposed to use the white of the paper. If you want to use the white of the paper, you have to use masking fluid, which I hate using. It's horrible stuff, all gooey and gummy. And you're not supposed to use black. Well, I rarely use black. I don't like it as a watercolor color, but I'm afraid I like to use the white. I don't see anything wrong with using a lovely watercolor white or the bleed-proof white to put in your lights that are much too hard to leave if they're just tiny whites. Now I'm adding ultramarine blue and Prussian blue to my foreground because the ocean was quite dark at the edges, had some very dark shadows, and it makes, again, the lights look lighter when you have some lovely darks, and the shadow, of course, under the iceberg using Prussian blue, indigo, ultramarine blue. And now this is the very tricky part. This is painting the very light side of the iceberg, painting the shadows. And I'm using all of my different colors, my cobalt with the rose in it, and my viridian with a little bit of cobalt in it. And I'm very carefully using the two of them to paint the shadows, sometimes blending it with a wet brush and sometimes close to the tip there, leaving a nice hard edge to make it look crisp. And you may think this looks too dark, but it will dry much lighter. And sometimes when I'm filming, the colors aren't that true to how they really are. I don't have a fancy camera. I just use my iPad. I don't have any fancy lighting. I just use my ordinary lighting in my workroom. So nothing about this is very fancy. It's just to help you with your painting. And I switch from one to the other in these colors. Sometimes my warm blue, sometimes my greenish blue, and go carefully and slowly. Also, I forgot to mention, I have speeded this video up, so I don't paint this fast. I need to shorten the video so I can upload it easily to YouTube. So I speed it up to make it shorter and quicker. I paint much, much slower than this. Don't try to emulate that speed, whatever you do. You'll have a mess. Sometimes you have to paint very slowly so that you can really think about where you're putting your brush and what you're doing. I'm darkening that area again, that shadow. As I darken that area, the shadows I've just put in will look lighter in contrast. And the good old Kleenex in your hand, that always helps. So I've fast forward quickly to the sort of finishing touches, darkening the shadows again with another layer. You always need to start light and then figure it out as you go along. See if you need to go a little bit darker, add a little bit more paint, add another layer. And right at the very end, just a few touches of the white paint to crisp everything up. I was actually quite happy with this one, even though I made a mistake on the sky at the very beginning, and though I made a mistake by not leaving the white reflection in the ocean, it all came out just fine. And if you can see on the right, the warm sky that I put on at the beginning with the raw sienna and the permanent rose, it just gives it a very warm glow against all of the cool paint. So it's complementary color. Some pink complementing the green, and it's a sort of an orangey glow which complements the blue. So it's doing two jobs in one, and I'm glad I put it there. I just didn't execute it very well. Now this is the fiddling time. You fiddle with a few more shadows. I'm putting the lines on the edge of the shaded area, getting a little bit more white to pull back some of the edges and make them look more crisp. Gotta love that white. I regret all those years I didn't use it. Thanks for watching.